I don't know, it didn't make any sense to me. I was like, what are you doing with this? Like, this is so dumb. Like, why would you do this? And it doesn't even matter. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jen, as you know, and today I'm going to be going through what I read in January. So this video can kind of be split up into three different sections. First are the books that I read, like fiction. In this case, it's nonfiction. Then I read some short stories / novellas, and then I'm going to be talking about the comics that I read at the end. And so if you're not really interested in the comics, you can kind of skip that part. Regardless, I kind of went through an interesting phase this month. I wanted to start it off by finishing some books I had begun in December, but didn't quite get to finishing them because of, the holidays and all that lovely stuff that happens. And of course, I wanted to find a way to get back into reading. I had taken a bit of a break due to work and due to a lot of different things. And so that's why I kind of turned to novellas and also to comic books, just to have that, satisfying feeling of accomplishing reading something and finishing something completely. Now, to start on the first book that I read, it is White Tears, Brown Scars, How White Feminism Betrays Women of Color by Ruby Hamad. Now, if you watched my reading journal video, you would have seen that I talked briefly about this because I had put in my journal how much I had rated it at the time, which when I first finished this, when it was like January 2nd or 3rd, it was around 3 stars. I decided after thinking about the book and the contents of it in particular to move it up to a 4-star rating, just because I think that the topic itself is really important. And as in the title, it's basically how white feminism kind of uses or white feminists use their own presence within society to put down women of color to ensure and leveraging their own stereotypes against women of color. So for example, the idea of the damsel in distress and the pure white woman that needs protecting, and kind of leveraging that against men to put women of color down, which I think is a very important discussion to have, because most of the time when we talk about racism, we talk about men and how they have the power and how they control things. But it's also white women and women in general who have power and who also have some kind of influence on how other women are portrayed or received by society and in groups and communities. So one of the reasons why I gave this book a 3 stars to begin with was because although the chapters were distinct, I still found that Ruby repeated herself during different chapters on topics that she had covered previously. Although I understand that repetition is the way that we learn, I didn't really find it that convincing, or even that it wasn't a good use of repetition. It just fell flat most of the time, and I had to skip over some paragraphs when she was going through or summarizing a topic that she had just covered in the previous chapter. Found it kind of very boring and just a waste of time. Some of these topics that she discusses are very important and they are impactful, and they don't need to be muddled or mixed up with others. She could have really taken the time and taken the words that she had used to summarize some other topics into the ones that she was actually talking about and going into a little bit more detail, which I would have really appreciated. This book feels a lot like the tip of the iceberg of white feminism and the problem of it when it comes to intersectionality. And so I do appreciate the fact that this is one of the first books to ever discuss this topic. And of course, I really appreciate the fact that this is coming from a voice outside of the US and outside of North America, because we can be very American centric, and it's really interesting to see feminism and racism from other points of view. So I really appreciate that within this book, and I really appreciate her being the first to discuss it. But I rated it initially 3 stars because she had already written an article which kind of spurred her writing this book. And I feel like she could have gone into more detail and she could have done a little bit more research to show and be more impactful in the topics that she was writing about. Like, for example, she mentioned some women that had read her article when it first came out and how they had been impacted professionally because they had shared the article within their circles. Like, some of them lost their jobs. And she kind of mentions them very briefly, and it doesn't really go too much into like, okay, how are they dealing with this now? Like, how, because like they see this so clearly, like this dynamic between white women and women of color, how is that changing their behavior, if any changes? One of the women that did read the article and lost her job started her own company in teaching organizations how to deal with like women of color and white women, and in terms of like what the article had written about and about this book is writing about, like when white women feel threatened and they start putting women of color down. So I would have liked to know, okay, like how is she actually approaching this? How are organizations actually reacting to that? Like, are they actually taking in what she's suggesting, or are they just, kind of virtue signaling and taking her input and then paying her and being like, yeah, this is our way of saying that, we've checked off like this diversity thing that we need to do every year. So I would have liked a little bit more detail. I still think it's a really good book. I think it's definitely a book that you should read, and that's why I bumped it up to 4 stars. I still think that the writing could have been better. It could have been researched a lot better, and I still think that, overall, I would be interested in seeing a second book on this topic from her that hopefully goes into a little bit more detail and isn't just like it feels like a digestible version for mainstream. So that's what I have to say about Rupi Hamad. But if you read it, let me know if you agree or if you don't agree. And yeah, the second stage of books that I mentioned, like the short stories, novellas, kind of started with the Murderbot Diaries by Martha Wells. So I had been recommended to read this series by a friend for many, many years. I had read the first book a while ago, like I think a year or a year and a half ago, or even longer actually, 2 years maybe. And although I enjoyed the book, it was a short story, I didn't find the time or the interest to want to continue the series. So this month I decided, okay, let me try to get back into it. Let me try to finish the series and like try to give it the shot that obviously my friend wants me to give it. So I went on to read book 2, 3, 4, and 5 of this series, and there's the 6th book that I need to finish. It's the last one, so I can finish the whole series. And I rated this series like very high. I gave it 4 to 5 stars. I think it just depended on which book. So I really enjoyed book 3 with Mickey, and book 5, Network Effect, which was Martha Wells' like first novel for this series, as the other ones I mentioned are novellas or short stories. The Network Effect, the 5th one, was a full novel. And some of the reasons, I should actually talk about like what it's actually about. So the Murderbot series follows a security unit, which is basically a like robot with like physical parts, like material parts, like skin and blood and stuff like that. So it's not full robot. It looks human if you don't if you take off its suit. And basically it's contracted by a company to different to other companies or to research organizations, and it follows them to different planets to help protect them against any threats, whether they be from other humans or from like aliens or from just general mishap that may happen. So in the first book you find out that this particular security unit has hacked his module, so the thing that controls him and makes sure that he doesn't like go rampaging around. And I say this like that because they're not allowed to, like they basically have a kill switch in their head, and if they do anything that's against the organization's rules, they basically get like destroyed. So it doesn't really work that way, but they have it. There's a lot of like talk about like rogue units and like the havoc that they cause. So he's they are very, very secretive about the fact that they've hacked their governor module, they've turned off the kill switch, but they're still performing their duties as they normally would. And in the first one, he meets a group of researchers led by a woman called Dawn Abernay, and basically he escapes with them from an alien attack, and some other shenanigans happen, because I don't want to give away the whole story for the first one. Basically, he escapes with them, and they decide to buy him due to the fact that they are from a planet that isn't corporate owned, like isn't owned by an organization. They are owned by like the humans, so they try to buy his independence, and then in doing so he decides to run off and kind of decide what they want to become and what they want to do and like what they want, because they don't want to be owned anymore, and they also don't want to be like a pet robot. So the second, third, and fourth book follows their adventures and kind of figuring out what they want to do and what they are, what their wants, all that kind of lovely stuff. What attracted me to the books finally after so many years after reading the first one was because I had been in discussions about like AI and the idea of like what makes us human, and this series of books really kind of goes into that. Like, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to have sentience? What does it mean to have your own independence and not be controlled or be told what to do based on like how like you're made or what you're made of? And like, what's the line basically? Because there are humans that have mechanical parts attached, and like they've been advanced technologically. So what's the difference between them and a they call themselves a murderbot that has physical parts as well, but has been created through code, basically. So yeah, it's a really interesting like sets of novellas and then novel at the end. One of the reasons why some of them I've rated 4 and why I rated some of them 5 was because they became a bit like tropey, or not tropey. They became a bit too routine. Like, you could see what was going to happen. You could see like, oh, okay, yeah, now this is gonna, like, they're gonna get attacked, and the murderbot's gonna have to, save the day and go through all these like action-packed moments. And at that point, like, when I can see the formula of a novel, I tend to rate it a little bit lower because of that. Not because I think she was writing in a lazy way, but because I think she was trying to explore certain subjects and tropes within the novellas, and I think that having an easy kind of formula story-wise allows that exploration, because then you don't have to focus on telling a complicated story. You can tell like a very simple story and focus on the relationships, and that's why it's still like a 4-star and 5-star for me. Overall, I would say like I definitely recommend it. I'm really excited to read the 6th book and see where it ends up going and what they decide to do. I really enjoy this series, even though it's in first person. I tend not to like first person books, but this one actually isn't annoying, and there you don't have a very annoying voice to read. So if you also don't like first person books, I would still recommend that you give this one a shot. I think you would really like it. Especially if you like sci-fi. I think you'd really like it. So the next short story that I read was The Last Romantics by Tara Conklin. Now, I was recommended this book by, well, not really, I wasn't recommended directly. I was watching a bunch of booktubers, and I saw this book, this short story, on many of their, like, I really like on their recommendation lists. And I was like, oh, I'm interested in reading short stories, novellas this month. Let me give it a shot. And I did not finish this book. I basically, the short story follows like a family that, or in particular, this one woman who's now a poet. She writes this poem called The Last Romantics. She gets asked about it when she's like 80 something, and she's retiring by and she's asked about like what the meaning is behind this poem, and she goes on a long story telling about her family and about like what happened to them as children, and then how they kind of pulled together now that when they became like adults in their 20s and 30s. And although the premise seemed kind of interesting in terms of, relationships and family dynamics and like growing up and all that stuff, I found it a really, really hard read to get through. It felt really long and boring at times. I couldn't get through some of her writing, unfortunately. I think it was interesting to feel this way for a short story, and I did feel at some point that I should finish it because it was a short story, and it was like, why would I not make the effort in? But then I noticed that I was looking at the page numbers and counting down the pages that I needed to read before I was finished, and I decided that wasn't a good, that's not a good way to read when you're going through a book and you're like, okay, I'm at page 46 of like 300. Nice, I'm almost there. That's not really an interesting way to get into reading again, and that's the whole point of this, is that I wanted to get back into reading, and slogging through something that wasn't inspiring me to continue, I felt was just like a waste of my time. So I chose to not finish it, and I put it aside. I have to say mostly one of the reasons why I wasn't really inspired to continue was because I didn't really think the relationships that she was portraying were that impactful or that interesting. They are 4 kids, and they all are doing like different things based on how based on like obviously their parents and what happens between their parents. And it feels like something that would be like a nice like slice of life kind of book to go through, but again, I wasn't drawn in by any particular character. I didn't find any one of them particularly interesting. I just found it all kind of like a bit cliche at sometimes, and not in a good way. I like my cliches just like anybody else, but I didn't find any of these ones really impactful when like they're all cliches and they're all kind of like stereotypes. And again, this is a short novel, and I wasn't getting anywhere in terms of depth of the relationships. Like I was comparing with Murderbot, where, with Murderbot, the story was formulaic, it was simple, but the relationships and like the depth of like the inner monologue and inner character development was impactful and was really convincing, and it really made it for an easy and fast read. Well, this one didn't have that kind of impact, so I just put it down and I wasn't interested in continuing it. And so I apologize if this is a book that you liked, and I would also recommend that, if you want to give it a shot, do so and let me know what you think, and if I should actually like slog through it a bit more and it gets better, because like if you tell me it does, I'll give it a shot. Like, why not? I've got time to kill. I'm gonna have some tea. The next short story that I read was the Tangle Palace by Marjorie Liu. I was super, I'll put the book right here. I was super attracted to it because of its cover. I really love like the wispiness of the art, and also it's basically a retelling of some myth and fairy tale stories, which I also really enjoy. And I can't speak highly enough of this book. I really obviously it's different short stories, different retellings of different fairy tales. Some of them aren't like direct retellings, some of them are inspired by different fairy tales, but I really loved the majority of them. There were some of them that I was like, they're okay, but they still were like really clever and really interesting in terms of their retelling. I know a lot of them talk about like the Sleeping Beauty retelling, and although that one was interesting, I have to say the one that I enjoyed the most was the one about like the queen in the forest. There's a lot of like creepy forest imagery in this series of short stories, and I really love that because forests are scary. But I really like this. I really enjoyed her weaving of like fantastical with like the day to day. I really enjoyed how there's obviously like a modern twist or a modern mindset when it comes to these characters that you follow. I really enjoyed like the creepiness of it, even though it's January, not October. You can always enjoy horror any time of the year. And this one wasn't a bad horror, so I really, like when I say bad horror, I mean like violence for the sake of violence, especially gratuitous. I'm not really into that. I like psychological horror, which sometimes that went into, and so I definitely recommend this book. I don't want to talk too much about it because when I don't like something, I talk a lot about it so that you don't read it. But if I like something, I talk less about it because I want you to read it. So hopefully this has piqued your interest and you'll want to pick it up. And I hope you do because, yeah, it's really good. And I got it off the library. That's why I don't have a physical copy of it. But so it's available at your library and you should pick it up when you can. Now, the next kind of chunk that I read was the end of January. I had unfortunately realized that due to work picking back up again, I didn't have that much time, and I wanted to read through some like really short stuff that I don't know, would make my life a little bit easier and give me something to talk about when I was like hanging out with all of you right now, for example. So I read a bunch of comic books. I first started off with Avatar: The Last Airbender, the Search comic book by Jean Luang Young, and I chose that one because I have meant to read the Avatar comic books for a while now, especially since I really loved The Last Airbender and I also really like Korra. So I really wanted to finally take the moment, since January was apparently my month, to, finally giving things shots that I kind of started and kind of sort of enjoyed but not really gave my time to. That's this month. I started with The Search. Now, The Search is about Zuko looking for his mother, and that's basically a very simple summary of what the three comics are about. And I consider for myself like one book because they're so short, and so I overall enjoyed it. The art is so similar to the show, so it's really easy to feel like it's part of the show again, and you're kind of continuing on. The story itself is pretty straightforward. As I mentioned, it's him looking for his mother, and he kind of has to partner up with his sister. And of course, like, his father is there conniving in the back. Pretty standard, Zuko family stuff. I didn't particularly like it. I think I'd give it like a 3. I like it, but I don't think it was as impactful or as interesting as it could have been. Like, in the show, they make it very clear that the day that his mother disappeared really weighs heavy on Zuko's mind because he blames himself partially for it. And so when I read the comic, I thought there was going to be a little bit more like emotions, a little bit more, going through like what exactly happened with his mom and like kind of unpacking those feelings about finally finding his mother. And I find that it didn't end up being about that. It ended up like on the side, really going into, but not really addressing Azula's like mental illness, but just like showcasing how she's slowly losing her mind and losing control over her mind. And it felt a bit like contrived at that point because, like, I don't know, the crazy bad guy seems a bit overused, and that wasn't really the point of Azula. And so when they brought her back in to help him find his mother, which I found was, I don't know, like, it didn't seem to really, he didn't really need her from what I understand. And also there's a moment where, you find, I don't know if this is a spoiler, but spoilers. you find out that like obviously his mother had a crush, and she had like a boyfriend before she married his father. And this man and her, like, they were exchanging letters while she was the fire lady. And when in one of those letters, she decided to write that, like, Zuko was his son, and Zuko's father Ozai like goes crazy. He's like, "How dare you lie about this?" And she's like, "It's a lie because I've only been with you." And he's like, "I know you're lying. Like, I've been having you followed since we got married." And it's just like, oh my god, like, why are we even having this conversation? And then he keeps the letter, like his Ozai keeps the letter. And that's what kind of pulls Azula into this whole shenanigan thing. And it doesn't even make any sense because Ozai in the series has been trying to get rid of Zuko like the entire time. Like the entire time he's trying to get rid of his son and give like the successionary, whatever the word. He wants to pass it on to his daughter, Azula. So why wouldn't he have just brought the letter and been like, "See, my son is illegitimate. Not my son. Get him out of here, peasant." And then just given Azula like legitimately the claim to the throne, and oh my god, and she becomes this I don't know why I'm so struggling with this word, and she becomes a successor. Like, it's such a simple like thing to do. So when you introduce this plot point and then it makes no actual sense, because again, historically through the canon, like, this character would have used it to their own devious means. Bringing it in a comic is just like, I don't know, it didn't make any sense to me. I was like, what are you doing with this? Like, this is so dumb. Like, why would you do this? And it doesn't even matter. Like, they bring this in and it's like there's this moment where he's like, "Oh, maybe like I'd be happy." Zuko's like, "I'd be happy not to be like Ozai's son, and I don't have to be the Fire Lord." But then, like, within a couple of pages after talking to the Avatar, he's like, "Oh yeah, I guess like it's important that I still be the Fire Lord and help bring balance to the Fire Nation and like help fix the relationships with the other nations." And I'm like, yes, like, we've gone through this. Like, we went through this in the series. Why are we going through this again? So yeah, sorry for ranting. I'm going to continue the other series and see how it goes. Like, I'm going to do The Promise, and I'm going to do like The Rift. I think I have that one next. And I'm going to see how those go. Maybe like I'll have a better time. The other comic I read was Extraordinary by Cassie Anderson. And that one, I'm just going to make it sweet and short to the point because it's only one little book. And I think it's for middle grade. I didn't say anything when I borrowed it that it was for middle grade, but it reads like it's for children. And it's a bit like tropey and straightforward. It's about like this ordinary girl who wants to be extraordinary, but she's a princess and her other sisters are extraordinary because they all have been like blessed by fairies with different powers. But when she was born, the fairy that came to bless her was like apparently a smoking butch lady fairy who decided to make her ordinary. And I was like, oh god, why? But okay, we're gonna go with this visual. And then when she goes to, so she's like, I want to be extraordinary. I want to find that fairy and I want to make her, change her blessing on me. So she meets with the fairy and the fairy's like, oh no, you're ordinary. How terrible. I thought it would be like a blessing for you to be ordinary. But she doesn't explain why that would be a blessing to her when she finally talks to the fairy. Like, or the fairy doesn't explain it to her, to the main lady, like why this would be a blessing. Like, she doesn't explain that, she doesn't have to worry. Or I don't even know, like, technically, like, for her in, like, the comic, ordinary means that she's plain. Like, she looks very plain looking and everything she puts on just becomes plain. And I find that kind of irritating because ordinary doesn't mean plain. It just means that you're not seeking stardom or something like that. I don't know. I think I'm a pretty ordinary person, but I also think that I'm also, like, I don't want to toot my own horn, but I think I'm also pretty good looking, you know what I mean? Like, one thing is not separate from the other. Like I think like she doesn't have a clear idea what ordinary means. She just went with like the most basic thing, which is like, yeah, you're plain and everything you wear is plain and it doesn't matter how much effort you're going to put in. Everything just looks plain on you, and it's very like teenagery in that aspect, and that's why I think it's middle grade. It didn't really appeal to me in that aspect because I feel like you could have done a better story with this. And I keep thinking of like Talking with Dragons, because I read that in high school and I really love that series, and it kind of goes into this idea of like what this woman was doing in the comic, but it does it in a better way. So don't read this comic and read Talking with Dragons instead, because that one is a better series if you want to kind of go through that topic. And the last comic I read, which I really enjoyed, was Sarah and the Royal Stars by John, oh my god, what's his name? John Swen. I loved it so much. I love, it's basically about a princess who has to go save the stars, like the actual constellations, and I love that shit. I love me some like Sailor Moon vibes. I love me a star princess. Are you joking? Especially a warrior star princess. Get to it. I love the art. It was so beautiful. It is beautiful. There's only the first volume out, and I'm really excited for the next volume to be out. The art is really beautiful. The story is really impactful. It doesn't take place in like, white America. I believe it takes place like in Persia. And so it's really gorgeous. I can't, talk more highly enough about it. So again, I don't go into too much detail about the books that I do like. So I really like this one. You should definitely read it and let me know what you think. And honestly, that's the end of what I read in January. So if you've read any of the books that I've read and you liked them and I didn't, let me know why, and if I should give it another shot or I should see it in another way. If I read something that you didn't like, let me know, because I like to hear why I made a poor decision in something. Like, change my mind. See if you can change my mind. And if there's anything that I should read, like based on what I say I like if you have any recs, let me know, because I am waiting on a couple of books in the library and I'm getting really frustrated with how long it's taking, but I'm number like 14 out of 86, so I think I'm almost there. Guys. And so yeah, thank you so much for joining me again. I hope you have a lovely 1st of February, Black History Month, and I'll talk to you all soon. Take care, everyone.